What's up, Outliers? Happy Sunday. Welcome, or Sunday, Saturday, whatever the day is. Welcome to a random stream. And I figured typically I'm starting to pivot Saturdays for the boys. No, I'm just kidding. Saturdays for kind of like Pro Plus live streams. But with the war in Iran going on and whatnot, I actually really like having a dedicated day that we can just poke through this. And for me to get caught up, I'm really interested in the conflict from two very different lenses. One of them is just militaristic, come from a military background. I find war and war dynamics interesting. And then also from my other livelihood angle, which is that of a trader and looking for opportunities. That's one of the coolest things I will continue to say about being a trader is that it indirectly puts you in front of a lot of things. And while it's kind of rare for traders to become like quote unquote actual experts on any one thing, you get to have kind of like a working knowledge of a lot of stuff, which fits to like my psyche quite well. So we're going to spend the first however long, I have no agenda, but we're going to spend the first however long literally reading news and trying to get caught up on what's going on. There's a video that I have queued up that I want us to watch, and it's just because I want to watch it. And I think it'll be pretty good. Let me move you guys over to the other screen really quick. Just got to make sure all this stuff is cleansed, which I think we're good. Yeah, we're all right. And I'll pull you back over. And yeah, so I had a coaching call earlier today where they were really interested in some of the futures trading that I've done over the last couple weekends, specifically on Sunday Open. And a lot of that is opportunistic and opportunities that are being presented by the current conflict. And that's the reality of it. Even though war is ugly, like war is awful, it's also a part of life, and I don't see it ever not being a part of life. It's part of the animal kingdom. We don't call it war, but it's war for them. And conflict is something to be expected. Because of that, while each conflict and each war tends to have its own flavors, its own themes, there are a lot of opportunities that become quite universal across them. And that's kind of what I want to spend a little time talking about as we go through this. Things specific to the war in Iran, which I think technically speaking, we're still not calling it a war somehow. I'm pretty sure I forgot what the fuck we're calling it. I love this new game where we just have to come up with new fucking words so that the lawyers can skirt whatever the rules are. So I forgot what this thing is called. Military operation, special military operation, whatever the fuck. Because I also think, technically speaking, in Ukraine, that's also not a war. According to Russia, that's like a special military operation. So, yeah. Oh, here we go. Designated Operation Epic Fury and Roaring Lion Israel. I thought that it would give us a actual tactical task, because like Operation Epic Fury, inside conflicts, we will have different operations and operation namings, right? Like Operation Desert Storm. There's in war and in war nomenclature, you still have like apparent conflict that this will be part of. So Operation Epic Fury is the current phase that we're in. But that's not the name of the conflict itself. That's an operation of the conflict. So I actually don't know what we're calling this thing, but I'm pretty sure we're still not calling it a war. Let's see if we can learn. What's up, Reese, Lauren, and Kirk? Great to see you all. And at the end of the video, we should at least be read up on the latest with what's going on with the conflict, and then ideally, by extension, have some ideas on some opportunities. We're obviously spending a lot of time on like the Sunday prep session going through specific opportunities, because we're still in the midst of where I think there's a big intersection. And it's not just in the things that we naturally would lean towards. It's not just being in something like defense names or whatever, but it's also the broad volatility that's opening up. That in and of itself, for me at least, is probably one of the more, if not one of the most interesting elements of this, which is if we take a look at the VIX complex, VIX right now is still clustering even above the 25 handle, which is quite impressive. But as I mentioned before, vol of vol, I still think is where the main story is. This is still way more interesting to me than anything, but this has caused pretty solid vol opportunities across the board. And it's periods like this where different kinds of base strategies of mine tend to come online. So a lot of the index vol stuff looks a lot better in here as we're starting to drift above 25. That slows down, and I have to be careful about the time frames that I'm playing, whatnot. And as we start getting closer to 30, funny enough, very frequently I'm actually going to be a buyer. And that's in kind of like the current regime. And the reason for that is just because vol tends to get more fairly priced as we get to those higher extension levels. And I think people are still struggling to price the vol of the conflict, which we will learn a little bit more about why that is as we go through some of this stuff. All right, so I'm gonna kick us off with a video. You guys have seen this guy before. I'm gonna kind of poke through this really quick, and I'll throw closed captions on, and then we'll kind of flip through really quick. But this is all about Kharg Island, and this is kind of a important strategic change in the conflict as it sits and where things are going. So I'm gonna hit play and we'll start flipping through here.
Percent of the country's entire oil exports are loaded before heading to the global market.
So what they just said is that's where a density of oil passes through. 95% of it is their quote. I do not have a fact check for that. I'm not sure if it's positive. I'm sure we'll get to the bottom of it in a little bit, but a decent amount of most of their oil flows through there. And you'll find stuff like this actually pretty regular, especially for more landlocked countries like Iran. Because, I mean, when I say landlocked, I mean, they obviously are water access, but mostly on like the southwest, west, and southern borders. They have that general region where they can access. And if they want to move goods otherwise, you're essentially sending stuff through massive deserts. So let's get acquainted really quick with Iran and where Iran sits. We have access, convenient access to water on their southern coast here through the Persian Gulf. And then we also have a little bit of access up here, but the important part of the access up here is that it looks a lot different than you think with this entire mountain range here. So if we zoom in for posterity's sake, and we just kind of like look around where their refiners are and then where that access is, you zoom in a lot on Google Earth, you'll notice a really important feature that you ain't looking at much. You're looking at big ass deserts. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't move stuff across deserts. Of course you can, but it's just not as economically viable. That's also why right now, with the Strait of Hormuz being in the context that it is, this is also why you're actually starting to see resources from Kuwait, specifically UAE and whatnot, that are moving things over on the west side. And the reason for this is because you can completely bypass the Strait of Hormuz, and they can just literally run pipelines west through Saudi Arabia and then load in the Red Sea and then move things out through here. The reason why we didn't do that right from the jump is because that's less efficient. What I've explained before, and there was somebody on Reddit, or not on Reddit, on X, let me find it. There was somebody on X that was like trying to dunk on someone else for something that was, it was kind of silly, realistically. And it's because I think it's a really big misconception of just the human condition and how we do things. So let me find really quick. It was a reply. This right here. If we look at this, get this. Perfect. If we look at this post, you can see somebody essentially saying like, hey, could we do this instead? Instead of going through the Strait of Hormuz, could we drop oil off here, carry it across, and then pick up over here, which again, essentially is just moving stuff this way. And the funny part about this is certainly can. Also, the Gulf of Oman is absolutely accessible, and there's some really big ports there. But this person started trying to dunk on it. Bro thinks they can just Mad Max a couple million barrels of crude through the desert of Oman every day. And the funny thing about this is, while this person thinks that this is some sort of like smart comment, is it's actually pretty fucking stupid. Because if that was optimal or preferable for whatever reason, it would be done. Period. It would be done. And the comment that I made, I think here, is about the pyramids, right? Like the Egyptians built these massive fucking pyramids with stone that they didn't have local from a quarry that was pretty damn far away for the fuck of it. Like the pyramids didn't provide energy. Now, I say that partially in jest. It wasn't for the fuck of it. There was a lot of religious backing to it, which is actually a pretty powerful tool. But the main point that I'm making there is that it didn't immediately change their day-to-day life, and they were able to build several of them. The point is humans are capable of a lot of stuff. And another great reminder is we've put people on the fucking moon. So if for whatever reason this was deemed a better long-term alternative, it would be done. And the reality is there's a cost associated with doing all of these things. And for example, Taiwan. For a long time, the US was complacent and comfortable with the current cost structure and being able to import from Taiwan. As pressure from China has expanded and their preference to consume or reconsume, depending on your standing, Taiwan, the US has now made the very costly and difficult decision to begin onshoring more domestic production of chips. And it's because the hand was forced. They don't want to. It's way more expensive to do that kind of shit here, but the hand was forced. It's the same thing here. If for whatever reason stuff with Iran carries on too long and it's not looking viable, it's looking way too unlikely that the Gulf would be open in any sort of sustainable fashion, then you would absolutely better believe that this kind of route would absolutely be a thing. And they could do it a bunch of different ways. They can literally just move fucking pipelines. There's a ton of stuff that they could do to bypass this. If they were even so inclined, they literally could dig a fucking channel over this and turn this into an island. Cost is a function of where are the incentives. So right now, the incentives are to continue doing the stuff that's going on and to try and come to some sort of agreement with Iran that is deemed satisfactory. And there's a cost associated with that. You can see that at the pump. You can see that in crude oil and so on. But there's also all of the political and the lobbying side of stuff, which I'm not going to touch in the concept of this. I simply want to talk about some of these overlaying features because, so for example, from a trader's lens, if your entire thesis is predicated on oil going through here, that is a massive gap in your thesis. And it is because, again, there are less cost efficient, but other viable modalities to move oil through things like the Red Sea, even potentially by land over to Oman or to the Gulf of Oman and so on. That does not mean that there's not a near-term impact of this and any other routing. There absolutely is. But Those are temporary. And that's the important thing to keep in the back of your mind, that these are temporary. All right, let's get back to the video now that we're 7 seconds in.
The tiny 21 square kilometer island holds massive outsized strategic importance, and because of this, Axios, Bloomberg, and other outlets are now reporting that their sources inside the White House are saying that they're seriously discussing and considering a special forces military operation to capture Iran's Kharg Island.
This is something that has been talked about ad nauseum. And one of the things that we experience from being on the consumption side, right, the citizen side of these conflicts, is we kind of just see what ends up happening. But we're not seeing all of the contingency plans that are made and being made. And this is a big one. Kharg Island is actually a really, really important part of their infrastructure. And you'll notice as you look at it, you see how the color of the water changes around this. And that's for a really good reason. It's because it's shallow, 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 and then very deep. That depth is actually important for finding a place to load massive ships. There are literal building size ships in these tankers because, again, for optimization, you want to make them big enough to strike the balance between their size and how much they can carry versus how many trips and things like that versus the cost to operate them. There's an intersection of those lines, and carriers are thought through to that capacity. But you need a certain depth of water in order to navigate them. This is also why in a lot of places that you'll see military bases and whatnot, they're opportunistically dropped, not just because we want a military base, there's not one here, but a military base right here in Imam Hassan, but it could be because the ocean topography there is advantageous for it. That's what's going on here. All right, so let's continue with our video. We can skip through here. This doesn't matter. Here we go.
Middle East, the entire Islamic Republic of Iran's economy, the IRGC military spending, the nuclear and missile programs, and the government salaries are all funded by this single piece of infrastructure. Talk about a strategic vulnerability. To put this location into perspective, the island is only about half the size of Disney World in Florida. It's the strategic linchpin that controls the whole country's economy.
Now, again, this is another general decent thought process, but there's contingencies, and it's important to remember that there's contingencies. Iran, regardless of what we think of them, they're not stupid, and they are full well aware of the global paradigm, and they're full well aware of their current preferred utilization of Kharg Island, but that's not the only card on the table for them. They have not built their entire economy around this small island that is susceptible to pretty much any other powerful military might if rendered on it. That's not the reality here. We'll continue.
It's so strategically important that it was in the 90s in literal poll.
We're just skipping through this stuff.
Embark from here, and it.
By the way, 72-hour deodorant. I don't know about that. I mean, I don't consider myself necessarily an excessively stinky person, but 72 hours is kind of fucking crazy. If deodorant was good for 72 hours, at least for me, it kind of calls into pretty significant question what the fuck they're putting in it. But anyway,
it takes them just under an hour to reach Kharg Island.
So this is just talking about what it would take to get there. And by the way, if you haven't been listening to the pressers from the DOW, it is actually worth your time, just because, again, it's really interesting to see how things are evolving. You do have to get past a lot of the fucking propaganda promo. You know, Iran's military is crippled, and, you know, there's no Navy, but there's still more ships being destroyed every day. The reality is like, broadly, their military absolutely is crippled. And if this was a conflict where the US's tactical objective was simply to just destroy Iran writ large and their military, That's effectively done, and it could have been accelerated massively if so chosen. But this is the thing with war, in modern day war, is that the tactical tasks have a lot of nuance. This is why Trump was telling or asking Israel to stop bombing some of their oil infrastructure. It's not as big as bombs are. It's still quite scalpeled in terms of what's being targeted and what's trying to be left alone. And the U.S. is not attempting to obliterate Iran. The U.S. is attempting to apply enough militaristic pressure to cause capitulation, but not go grossly over it. That, again, is important to keep in mind, because if things were ever to escalate significantly, then that is absolutely a different story. But we will see. Okay, let's go. So this is just talking about different military strike packages and what that could look like in order to tackle this island. And the resistance there is, again, it's insufficient for any sort of large-scale conflict against. Then what Cappy is talking about here is like what kind of infrastructure there. Again, like he's more of a military style channel. That's why he's going deep into detail on this stuff. But the cliff notes of all of this is, if the island is deemed something that the U.S. wants or wants to obliterate, again, it will be done. That's it. Like, that's all there is to that story. But we'll continue through really quick. So there's a couple pieces that I do want to talk about specifically. I haven't gotten through the video, but I'm assuming it's going to talk about some of it. So let me see. Here we go.
Because currently Iran is exporting more oil than ever before, even before the war, because they are only letting their own ships through. The mission to strangle the Islamic Republic's oil at Kharg Island is also politically risky, because American support for even this current level of escalation in the war is low, sitting at around 40%, according to multiple polls, which are imperfect, but they give us a snapshot of an idea. Even though it's around 84% of Trump's base that is in favor of the war, overall, most Americans are not supportive, especially of any kind of prolonged war or any kind of soldiers seen operating on the ground in Iran.
So that part, I think, also just intuitively makes sense, specifically because we just got out of a big, long-standing conflict. Now, there is something that's worth talking about, and I was talking with my wife about this a little bit because, you know, she was asking what I thought of the prospects of boots on the ground and like physical occupation. Because right now the 31st MEU, which, fun fact, it operates on both coasts, but that's a pretty common MEU to be moving out of the West Coast, is steaming over there. That kind of thing takes a while for them to get there, but that will have a payload of Marines. And Marines are one of the groups that you would typically send to something like this. It's in a littoral region, and it's something that you want general limited scope to start, not large scale occupation, which is more what the broad army is built for. And the summation of it is sometimes people will dismiss things and they'll say like, oh, this is just like a war for oil. At a really high level, all countries are continually jockeying for resources. There are finite resources, and getting more of them at a better price level is actually really important to the long-term success of a nation. That's one of the reasons why the US has been so successful, is because of dumb fucking luck. The fact that the US in general happens to be generally isolated on both coasts, but exceedingly resource rich across the country. That's dumb fucking luck. The fact that just happens to be. But that is a critical element to how the US has become a superpower, and then again, depending on your perspective, a hegemon or not. So when people try to relegate war, that this is just about oil, I don't think it's fair to relegate just for oil as if it's not a critical part of the entire global economy. That is an ugly part of war. War is not always waged good versus evil. And I think that's something that people struggle to, wrap their mind around. That a lot of the backing for war is economic incentives, infrastructure incentives, and things like that. That's how it is. So the prospect of having boots on the ground and having physical people operating there is something I absolutely expected from the onset. And it's because expected as an option, I should say, not that it's guaranteed to happen or I think it's going to happen. I still think that there's a chance that it doesn't, because right now the US is still massing firepower in the region. But it's not an insignificant chance. And you have to remember the way that the White House, the DOW, is going to paint the picture. And the way that they're going to paint the picture is, we're just going to do this one little thing first. And then after you do this one little thing, then there's another little thing you have to do. And then after that little thing, you've already done two little things. There's a third little thing you got to do. The point that I'm making is that the average American is just really being strung along for a ride on something that's probably pretty well defined ahead of time. But you have to give it to them in bite-sized pieces so that there isn't an immediate result. This is the frog in the pan methodology. You start with room temperature water and you slowly raise the temperature, and the frog doesn't get out of the fucking pan and boils to death. That's what this is. It's the same thing. Slow, successive, incremental changes to apply pressure. That's also, fun fact, what Russia is doing with their general expansion. If you take a look at the size of Russia, Russia is unbelievably massive. Russia is unbelievably, I think people don't realize how fucking big Russia is. And what they're doing is ever so slowly, and again, because a lot of other countries, they think much longer term than the US, they're just ever so slowly expanding little bits here and there. And it's really, really purposeful. So with all the stuff that's going on in Ukraine, there's all the conversations about, is the region ethnically Russian and whatever? Like, none of that matters. Russia is just slowly doing what's in Russia's interest, which is expanding landscape and access to resources. All countries are slowly attempting to do that over time. That's what they do. And that's what causes conflict at some point, because then you have two countries right now, the US and China, that have a very significant vested interest in Taiwan. And that's why Taiwan is still being left alone, because there's two superpowers that know if there was a conflict over that, it would be really ugly and really bad for both. And they're attempting to find a way to amicably navigate around that. So zooming all the way back out, like prospects of physical people being on the ground, it's fucking war. There's zero part of me that would be flabbergasted if that occurs. And I would be more surprised if the threat of it wasn't on the table, because that becomes an increasingly powerful method to force capitulation. Because one of the things that the US is not doing now is blockading Iran. And the reason why they're not blockading Iran isn't because of an interest in harming Iran. They would love to do that. But it's because of the interest with China. That's what I'm talking about before, with this being such a constrained war, where even though there are right now very clear tactical objectives, they're still shadowed behind all of these underpinnings that exist and make it really complicated to do things. If the US felt like stopping literal flow of all ships through the Gulf of Oman, again, it would be done. But they're not doing that. And that's because right now we're not trying to piss off China more than we need to and stopping the flow of oil from Iran to China. It just so happens to benefit Iran, but the US isn't doing that to let Iran do it. It's doing it from the China lens. Lauren says, do you think a forced regime change is even possible? Sure, it's definitely possible. The thing that the U.S. is able to do, if they're so inclined, is literally just keep killing every leader that they elect until one is there that either capitulates. It's the same thing effectively that what we did in Venezuela. That's forced regime change. We landed in a country, literally took the fucking president out and took him. We literally took him. And then there's a power vacuum. So yeah, if there was a desire for some sort of forced regime change, entirely possible. Now, what I would argue is entirely not smart. I wouldn't call it impossible, but it is a unbelievable underpinning, is changing the fucking underlying governing system. That's why one of the things with Iraq, Afghanistan, and those things that is pretty ridiculous is trying to think that we're going to make them a fucking democracy. Like, that's crazy, because what you have to do is literally change an entire culture. But as far as a regime change, keeping the supreme leader structure in their current governing structure and leaving that alone and just trying to get a leader in there that's more preferable or amicable, yeah, that's completely doable. But whether or not, you know, it's stable or whatnot, that's a whole other thing. So, but yeah, I definitely think it's possible. It's absolutely possible. We literally did one of them within the last 6 months. Doing another one, we already did actually 2 of them, because we also got rid of the prior supreme leader. So fucking add a third to it. The trick there is, like, what are the consequences? Because creating power vacuums is nothing small either. And the US is maintaining a really delicate balance with entities like the Kurds, who very clearly would like to be involved here. But that is another bag. All right. So we have a ton of just general background and stuff here. Let's just flip through some of the latest news and see what's actually come out. And what's this thing? Okay, so this looks like the actual live updates. And then for those that don't know, Al Jazeera, that's owned, I want to say by UAE or Saudi or something like that. But everybody has their underpinnings and everybody has their bias. So whenever you read stuff like this, you have to do your bit of due diligence and try to read some of the same stuff from different sources to find yourself towards the middle. I'm literally not really looking for their analysis of stuff. I'm literally just looking for the headlines to see what's functionally happened. Like this, like air raid sirens in northern Israel. Yeah, that makes sense. And other news agencies probably would report that same thing. But there's missiles going back and forth. So that's continuing. Growing strain of conflict. So like this here is like an opinion piece. I don't really care that much for that. More missiles being intercepted. Iran warns UAE ports and American hideouts are targets. So that's Iran attempting to expand their control. And the more they do that, the more this riles up other neighbors and whatnot. So we'll see how that goes. And let's see here. This is 30 minutes ago. Continued attacks on Iran and vice versa, I'm sure. 15 people killed. The Revolutionary Guard warns people across the Gulf near oil ports and other main ports that those places can be targeted. Iran, Lebanon are keeping attacks on Israel. Trump says allies who rely on Gulf oil must help keep the Strait of Hormuz open. So this is something that Trump does that is interesting from a broader lens, is if the US wanted to deal with this by themselves, it's doable. But by getting other countries involved and invested, one, it shares the overall financial burden, but then 2, it creates a more powerful force in the aggregate. So this is kind of like the spending stuff with NATO and Trump insisting that other countries actually spend what they're fucking supposed to spend as a proportion to their GDP for NATO. Same here. The U.S. Embassy is asking U.S. folks to leave Iraq, which is super smart. Fun fact for the upcoming trip that we're looking at, we were originally looking at going back to Norway, and Norway had some sort of small scale threat in Oslo of like a domestic terror act that seemed to be somewhat related to this thing more broadly. So we ended up, we didn't not go there for that reason, but we just found another cool spot that we're interested to check out. So we're going to go be in Slovenia. But anyways, we'll continue. So Israel attacks on Lebanon, death toll is 826, and displacement is at about 1 million. All right. And let's just flip through a couple of these. So Trump is calling for allied warships. So again, this is the same thing we just read over there. Exclusive, Trump rejects efforts to launch Iran ceasefire talks. This is part of what I would imagine to be the broader plan, is just until the U.S. is ready. So I think that that's why they're not doing this. Okay, next. We already talked about people leaving Iraq. This is a cool map, by the way, if you've not seen this. They also have a similar version of stuff like this for Ukraine and Russia, but you can kind of see like what's where, and then you can zoom in and see like what kind of stuff is happening where. There's just a cool map I wanted to show you guys. This is all attacks on the Strait, standard stuff. Yeah, look at that. That's actually insane. That absolute crater. Gas prices have gone up pretty significantly on average, like 367. I'm so numb to gas here in California. I'm just so used to, I don't even know what I pay for gas. I've just become completely detached from it, but I always know it's expensive. Just strike maps and stuff. I don't think there's anything here. This Israel military, Iran-backed Hezbollah continued to trade strikes. They were increasing the pace of aerial attacks. There was an air refueler that crashed in Iraq. So American service members are at 13 minimum. 1940 people dead, most in Iran. 1350 civilians. War is ugly. This is talking about the ability to mine. So the thing for mining in general with something like this is it's kind of similar to the drone tactics. You just need the threat of them primarily. And the threat of the mines is plenty. So you don't even have to have like a bunch of them in there or get a bunch of strikes. You really just need them to be there or thought to have been there, and it will have the general intended effect, essentially the intended effect that's going on now. But the trick with mines in general is they don't really know friend from foe. So one of the reasons why Iran likely hasn't already done this is because they have a lot of friendly ship traffic that goes through there that would then also have to be able to navigate the mines, which again, they don't know friend from foe. So I imagine that would be lower down on their escalation list because it would innately impact themselves as well. Okay. I think that gets us pretty caught up here, if I'm not mistaken. We can get rid of all these and let's see what's going on here for the last bit. So this is just a general overview, and then we'll take a look through markets. So strike volume we know is high. We know that the We know that the Iranian Navy is combat ineffective generally. The reason why I say generally is because they still have what I would consider to be harassing attack capabilities, but you're never going to fully get rid of that, right? You can always have a fucking dude on a fishing boat with an RPG. So the thing to think about when we talk about stuff like combat ineffective, that doesn't mean that there's zero risk. It just means that there's no real ability to have significant footprint or mass fires. But they're still absolutely, they maintain the ability to use their fast moving boats. They have those still. They just don't have like a big Navy to project power or compete in any sort of significant battle. We've seen these stats a million times. I don't fucking know. So the death of Ali, that was 28 Feb. And his son was named the successor. We know that. So he was wounded during a strike that killed his father and is governing from a medical facility. All right. So we can see the changes in commodities. We'll talk about that a little bit. The conflict currently at a stalemate. U.S. Israel achieved air supremacy, but not committed to ground invasion. Iran regime degraded, but enough internal security to prevent a popular uprising from toppling new leadership. Yeah, I think that's actually a very objective way to frame it. I think that that's fair. Cool. All right. Let's take a quick look through markets now. We already talked a little bit about vol, and we already talked a little bit about commodities, and commodities still continue to be kind of the main place that I'm watching. So again, like tomorrow, I'm going to trade futures open. So far, I haven't seen any like big catalysts to have some sort of massive expectation of movement, but I still think that there's more likely than not to be more movement, more than enough movement, or at least enough movement for me to do stuff that's generally interesting. It's also early. We will see. Now, across the market, we're still seeing, again, the same broad trends that I have talked about for almost 3 months. If you go back through the different market update videos and stuff that I've done and all the different live streams, the leaders have continued to be the leaders and the laggards have continued to be the laggards. Like there's very little change there. So specifically things like energy and utility continue to do very well. I will say that healthcare has fallen off a bit. They're definitely going through a bit of a transitory phase. But as far as leaders, those are your leaders in sectors, energy and utilities. And then your laggards really remain the same. Financials have fallen off essentially for the past 3 months, almost unrelentingly. And then same thing with discretionary. Discretionary is done poorly. Staples were doing better, and then they've also begun a bit of an unwind. So here's one of the problems that I see. At the onset of the conflict, we were seeing pockets of weakness. And then a lot of other stuff was maintaining, like status quo / general strength. But we're seeing fewer and fewer things doing that. It absolutely is spreading. And we're not seeing, even things like the equal weighted S&P, so RSP, which is equal weighted, is also down kind of a lot. If you remember, leading into the conflict all the way up until March, this thing was doing great. And if we, again, zoom this thing out, it was literally at highs, just hanging out at highs. But the most recent news, really starting from the 3rd of March and on, has caused a fair unwind here. I actually don't know what's the percentage we are off of 1-year highs, 5.7%. So not quite at a correction yet, but a healthy move off. This kind of movement, compared to what I'm seeing in the sectors, compared to what I'm seeing from things like net highs lows and the moving averages for net highs lows, that all points down. Like these are all downside leading and downside breadth measures. As always, when I see stuff like this, I don't immediately pile on all the downside plays and stuff like that. But what I do is change the risk in the portfolio so that it makes sense given the broader context. So that's one of the main things that I see here across the sectors, industries, breadth in general. The other thing that is worth talking about a little bit, I think, is the opportunity in some of the isolated places that I want to talk about. Because right now we know the top line opportunity is in oil, gas, commodities outright. Then there's another direct opportunity in stuff like shipping companies, people who insure shipping companies, stuff like that. Then there's defense names, application, restocking. Again, we already talked about quite a few of those. We have stuff like Raytheon, all of those. They immediately popped at the beginning of the conflict, and they're still elevated. They've come down a bit, but they're still elevated from the start of the conflict. So that's another easy idea. There's also now a higher probability of inflation if this thing continues to go on for some duration. And then we also have supply chain measures and things that are going to get impacted from massive changes in supply chain. I think we've talked a lot about the defensive names and whatnot. My guess is most of you, this is like a really simplistic first order effect. I don't think there's necessarily a lot to like run through with these other than the fact that some of the positioning in the names is different. And that I do think is worth lingering on for just a moment. What I mean by this is as we flip through some of these defense names, you're noticing that they're not all behaving the same. And that gives you a really important context clue in terms of what is expected to participate in how in the conflict. That's something to keep in mind if you decide to go that route and you decide to start looking at, or you already are in some defense names, that's completely fine. But the trick there is they're not all participating the same, and you should be full well aware of that. If we look at total premiums here and we just flip through a few names, you can see that in general, the positive premiums are still flowing in to some of the defense names and actually scaling up a bit coming in on Friday. If we look at Lockheed next, bit of a different story. You're not seeing the same play in Lockheed that I just showed you in Raytheon. Another example that we were just looking at is Northrop Grumman. Interesting, similar story. Another that we can look at is Boeing. Very interesting story, actually quite the inverse. The point here is there's still absolutely a massive opportunity in defense names, but it's a little more segmented than you might originally think. Then we have obviously the direct participants, stuff like ExxonMobil, Occidental. And these are really, I think, good thematic ways to play oil in general, because even if the price in oil comes down, a lot of them will still do quite well. You'll see definitely a price correction or, change, and not necessarily 10% or whatever. But you'll definitely see a bit of a change in price whenever that news eventually breaks. But a lot of these names are still probably to do well. This also gives you a really, really cool opportunity to build some smarter trades. So you can do things like find individual companies that you think might be overextended to the upside, that have an interesting vol structure, and you can create a dirty pairs trade between that and the commodity itself, crude. Or you can do that and against one another, other things that they're well correlated with. I already have talked about some of my positions here directly, but I'm playing a mix of individual names, overall commodity based names, and ETFs. And I'm trading actually different directions over different tenors. I have a bunch of risk out in oil and oil proxies because of just how much it's been moving and how much of an opportunity I believe exists there. But this is another really good place to look. So you can check out stuff like Occidental. You can look at ExxonMobil. You can look at Chevron. You can look at ConocoPhillips. You can look at BP. All of these have really interesting relationships, and specifically their vol profiles change kind of a lot. This is one of the spots that I'm also really eager to keep a really close eye on for whenever the conflict looks to start to resolve, because some of the higher volatility names are absolutely going to have an initial reaction with a bit more velocity. That looks kind of interesting to me. Then there's stuff like refiners. So you can look at names like MPC, Marathon. You can look at stuff like Valero. You can look at stuff like PBF, stuff on the refining side of business. Then there's like tankers and shipping. We already talked about this. So Fro is getting absolutely smashed. DHT is getting absolutely smashed. Now, with stuff like this, there's, again, an interesting way to play this. You can play these either near-term continuation in the direction that they're moving, or you can play them as a reversal whenever that becomes viable. I would certainly not say that that would be in my playbook, at least at the moment. But another thing to keep an eye on, at least for my trading style, with stuff like this is leaders and laggards. So which of these are doing better in these overall conditions and what looks stronger? So another couple ideas, INSW, you can see like all of these essentially look the same. They're kind of like repeats of one another. And it's literally because what you're experiencing right now is there's a big difference between syncretic and idiosyncratic risk. And right now it's syncretic risk. This is stuff that's across all of them and impacting all of them. Then there's also TK. TK is, I noticed, way more velocity. I actually had a short in there, but my mistake, unfortunately, was I was running synthetic shorts, and it would have been way, way, way better to get some gamma, which I did not have. I was a little bummed about that. But overall, still really good opportunity, but bummed that I didn't structure it a little better. Then we also have things like LNG carriers. So Flex is an example of that, another spot to take a look. And it's because the freight rates for LNG are also going to go up pretty significantly. And a big part of that is because Qatar halted their productions. Then we can talk about airlines. Airlines are a direct consumer of all of this stuff, and significantly so. And airlines have been beaten over the head from this kind of move. These also provide really interesting continuation in both directions. And then whenever there is a change in the news, you'll likely see a fairly sharp reversal, at least in the near term, for quite a few of these. Again, you'll notice that most of them look the same. The near term, to me, still favors the downside. I'm not really in the business of trying to catch a falling knife with stuff like this. It's just not really economically viable. But that's why on most of them, I'm just going to drop in different kinds of alerts and keep an eye on them. Because, again, leaders and laggards, at least for my style of trading with momentum and whatnot, matters kind of a lot. This is interesting to me. I didn't quite see this before. I haven't looked at American closely. Yeah, so some people are starting to speculate on a reversal, but that still looks pretty fucking down to me. And let's take a look at the skew. Where are we at? 90, 80. Yeah, so the term structure is all fucked up. We have some cheap vol here at 70%. And then we have some more expensive vol here at 72 that then dips off again. And in terms of skew within the term, I'm trying to find the closest I can get to the same deltas. But I have to do a little bit of quick math. So let me move this. So the 10 strike is a 0.397 delta. And those are giving us 68.52% vols. And then the at the money calls are 0.422 deltas. And those are giving us 68.07% vols. So then we look at how much vol we're getting for delta across. So we're getting like 1.73 vols for the 39 delta puts, and we're getting 161 vols per delta on the call side. So a bit of put skews still, but that isn't as significant as you might expect, especially with the near-term move. Let me take a look really quick at a couple other measures. I want to look at Chris's stuff. Speaking of Chris, we had a podcast released on Friday about covered calls and the backdrop of covered calls, which to me is actually pretty exciting. Give me 1 sec. I'm going to grab another drink because I'm probably going to go a bit over. All right, we're back and we're refilled. Okay. I want to look at up here. Here. Look at AAL. Yeah, so the at the monies. Wow, the at the monies are interesting. And it's hovering still at pretty high realized vol. The risk premium in there isn't too great, but the thing that I'm actually looking in here is like, I actually like this from the short side, but it's such a cheap name. Like it's not something I would do in my own portfolio, but even shorting something like the 12s, I kind of like. Easy way to get some short deltas. I'll add that to my log that I track. What is today? 14 March. You're in AL. Spot is 10:30. At one of these. Where were we? We're at the 17 April. And looking at the 12s, which are at 26 delta. Get like 29 cents. Cool. We will keep an eyeball on those. All right, let me finish going through some of these other names that I think are at least stuff that you guys might want to add to a watch list or just keep an eyeball on. Well, we got Love, same bucket. Again, for the airlines, it's really seeing the relationships between those. Alaska, Air, and then JetBlue. All of those worth taking a look at. Now, travel, leisure, stuff like that. We have BKNG. This kind of stuff does not do well. And really, BKNG has just been doing poorly longer term. So this, I think, starts to become an interesting short opportunity. Let's take a look at the options chain really fast for BKNG. Fuck am I? BKNG. Oh. Whoa. What? Fuck. That is utterly shocking. Fuck is 20 March? Go look at that. What's happening there? 20 March. 6 in calls, 2 in puts. The calls are thick. 55, 57. Here. 5 and 57. Oh, are these short puts? The 52s? 56, 52 here. And then 4.4 mil here. And these are at the 5200. So let's go to the 5200. The put side in 20 March. 20 March. 5200, which are these. Yeah, these are all short. This is part of like a synthetic. Yeah. So these being so deep in the money, I don't actually care. That actually reminds me of another really cool idea. I'm gonna email these guys again with, I have lots of ideas for their platform because I like their platform a lot. Full disclosure, I am an affiliate for them, but they did not sponsor any of this. They already have like another ticket open for another thing that I'm looking at. Guys, yeah, that would be really cool for the platform. On this tab. Really cool. We'll see if we can get that one added. And then let me find the rest here from at least the broad list. So this I still like to the short side. I'm going to track this one too. 42, 41. Here, let's just 42, 40. It's a lot. We'll go to 15 May. And this one could be like synthetic short puts, long put, or short calls, long puts, whatever. I'm just kind of picking something random. The liquidity in here is just so god awful that it's more the general idea that I want to track more than anything. 47. And let's say that we would get those for 278 or something. That's fine. Okay. And let's flip through a few more of these. Expedia, same boat. Airbnb, Carnival Cruise Lines, which has been dying for a while now, Royal Caribbean, and then Norwegian. All of those kind of same bucket. And then we could talk about some shipping logistics stuff. So there's UPS and FedEx that have been caught up in this broader move. Again, the same general ideas that I shared earlier apply now. And those ideas being playing the continuation or reversal, either or I think is on the docket. But you just have to be careful on obviously how you structure stuff. And then you can also see FedEx has been way more resilient here. Way more resilient. So like compared to the relationship between FedEx and UPS, FedEx has been much stronger. Then there's also some stuff for like fertilizer and agricultural inputs. So these in general can be pretty sensitive to stuff like this. CF, we have NTR, and then we have Mosaic. All of these, Mosaic's a little bit different business model, but just to give you guys some general ideas. And then from like gold and stuff like that, you guys already have. The tech side of stuff you guys already have. So, I mean, those are a bunch of individual names that look pretty interesting to me. And then tomorrow during market prep, we'll go through and actually build a bunch of trades because I have a bunch of stuff that rotated off last week, just taking advantage of the opportunities as they came up that I now kind of want to rebalance because my portfolio writ large definitely has room. So right now I am 77% utilized as of right now. So I definitely have more room to go with where I think the market is right now. So that will be my game plan. Any questions or anything that you guys would like to hit before I wrap up and go knock out a little bit of move? And then for those interested on Reddit, I just did an AMA today and there's some like decent stuff in there. So there's a couple good questions that are probably worth at least taking a peek at. Cool. All right, gang. Well, I don't have any questions for you guys. I don't see any questions for me. So for the pro members, I'll see you guys on market prep tomorrow. And then for the pro plus members, we have our Zoom workshop on Monday. We're going to be taking a closer look at strategies. And for everybody else, I'll see you guys on the next live stream. Video dropping tomorrow is every Sunday. You know, Outlier. See you guys later.